Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
Picture this moment frozen in time, a scene that still sends chills racing down my spine even after all these years, when I stood there in the dim glow of our family dining room in that stuffy suburban house on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, where the air hung heavy with the scent of overcooked roast beef and unspoken judgments, my hands trembling slightly as I forced myself to meet my father's stern gaze across the polished oak table that had witnessed so many of our strained gatherings. Over the years, his voice booming with that authoritative tone he reserved for closing deals at his insurance firm, declaring without a shred of hesitation that my decision to drop out of college after just 2 semesters had branded me an irredeemable failure in the eyes of everyone who mattered. Especially since my so-called unappealing looks and lack of social grace made it impossible for me to ever blend into the polished world they all aspired to, a world of country club memberships and neighborhood barbecues where appearances dictated worth more than any hidden talent or quiet ambition I might have buried deep inside. My mother, perched elegantly at his side with her pearls clutched tightly as if they could ward off the embarrassment I represented, chimed in with a sigh that carried the weight of her own shattered dreams from her younger days, suggesting in that passive-aggressive way of hers that I was simply too plain and unremarkable to compete in the cutthroat arena of higher education or professional success, her words slicing through me like a dull knife because they echoed the insecurities I'd harbored since puberty hit and left me with freckles and a figure that never quite fit the mold of the cheerleader types who dominated our high school hallways, types like my younger sister Lisa who sat there quietly picking at her salad, her wide eyes flickering with a mix of sympathy and relief that it wasn't her under the microscope this time. The conversation spiraled from there into a full-blown intervention disguised as concern for the family legacy, my father pounding the table lightly to emphasize how my withdrawal from the state university, not due to laziness, but because the tuition bills had piled up like snowdrifts after Dad's business took a hit during the recession, forcing me to choose between starving as a student or surviving in the real world, would tarnish the Harper name in our tight-knit community where gossip spread faster than flu season, and my aunt chimed in via speakerphone from her Florida condo, her voice dripping with faux compassion as she advised me to consider community college or vocational training since 4-year degrees were clearly beyond my reach given my circumstances. Lisa, ever the peacemaker in our fractured dynamic, leaned forward with that earnest expression she wore like a badge, whispering that perhaps I could crash on her dorm floor for a bit while figuring things out, but even her offer felt laced with the pity of someone who knew she was the favored one, the straight-A student bound for glory while I faded into the background of their narrative, and by the time dessert was cleared away, the consensus had solidified into a cold decree. I was on my own. No more allowance checks or emotional support, just a swift packing of my belongings into garbage bags that my mother handed over with a curt nod, her final words ringing in my ears as I loaded them into the trunk of my rusty old Honda Civic, the one they'd always teased for its mismatched hubcaps and perpetual oil leaks, telling me that ugly college dropouts like me didn't belong under their roof anymore if I couldn't pull my weight in the prestige game they played so meticulously. Driving away that rainy evening, the wipers slapping rhythmically against the windshield as tears blurred the taillights of passing cars on the interstate, I felt the full crush of isolation settle over me like a lead blanket. Heading toward a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex on the east side of Columbus, where the rent was cheap enough to afford on the scraps from my part-time job at a big-box retail store. The kind of place where fluorescent lights buzzed endlessly overhead, and customers treated you like furniture unless they needed directions to the clearance aisle, my shifts stretching from dawn till dusk in a polyester uniform that chafed against my skin and soul alike, folding endless stacks of jeans and sweaters while replaying the dinner scene in my head, wondering if their cruelty stemmed from genuine disappointment or just the fear that my stumble might expose the cracks in their own facade of middle-class perfection. Nights blurred into a monotonous haze of instant noodles heated in a microwave that hummed like a dying insect, and solitary evenings curled up on a sagging futon with my laptop balanced on my knees, The screen's blue glow the only companion in that dimly lit space where thin walls amplified the arguments of neighbors and the distant howl of sirens reminded me how far I'd fallen from the safety net of family barbecues and holiday cheer. Yet amid the despair, a stubborn spark ignited from those introductory coding courses I'd squeezed. During my college days, free online modules that had opened a window to a digital world where appearance and pedigree mattered less than problem-solving grit, prompting me to tinker with basic scripts during lunch breaks, dreaming of an application that could link everyday folks like me, those sidelined by finances or family pressures, with accessible learning resources tailored to real-life schedules, an idea born from the bitter irony of watching my relatives pour thousands into Lisa's tuition, while scorning my pleas for help. Humor crept into those bleak hours unexpectedly, like when I'd scroll through my parents' social media feeds on my phone, chuckling at the over-the-top captions on their latest golf outing photos that screamed of borrowed affluence and performative happiness. A private rebellion that steeled my resolve against the voices in my head urging me to call and beg forgiveness, because deep down I knew apologizing would only validate their narrative of my inadequacy, and instead I channeled the hurt into late-night coding sessions fueled by black coffee from the corner diner, where the waitress knew me by name and slipped extra sugar packets without asking, her quiet kindness a stark contrast to the rejection echoing from my past. As weeks turned into months, the financial strain mounted with utility bills arriving like uninvited guests and the car breaking down twice in one pay cycle, forcing me to bike to work in pouring rain that soaked through my sneakers and left me shivering in the stockroom, but those hardships only sharpened my focus on the app concept, fleshing out features like community forums for skill sharing and AI-driven course recommendations that could empower dropouts and working parents across the Midwest, regions I knew intimately from growing up in Rust Belt towns where opportunities felt as scarce as honest politicians. One exhausting night after a double shift that left my feet throbbing and my spirit frayed, I collapsed onto the futon with a lukewarm soda in hand, the laptop whirring to life as ideas flooded my mind in a rush of clarity. Connecting disparate threads from user pain points I'd overheard at the store to the educational gaps I'd navigated myself, solidifying the prototype's framework into something tangible and promising, yet as euphoria mingled with exhaustion, a wave of doubt crashed over me, questioning whether this solitary gamble on code and conviction was a genuine path to redemption or just another desperate grasp at proving wrong the family who'd labeled me worthless, leaving me staring at the blinking cursor in the quiet darkness, heart pounding with the uncertainty of what lay ahead in this uncharted territory of self-made survival. Diving headfirst into that app prototype after that late-night epiphany felt like grabbing hold of a lifeline in a raging storm. The kind of desperate commitment that had me sacrificing sleep and sanity in equal measure while the world outside my apartment window carried on with its indifferent rhythm of traffic hums and distant laughter from bar patios. My days now a frantic blur of retail shifts where I'd zone out scanning barcodes at the checkout line, mind racing ahead to debug sessions on the bus ride home with my laptop teetering on my lap amid jostling passengers who eyed me curiously as if I were some eccentric inventor lost in her own bubble. The financial pinch tightened like a noose around my neck those early months, with rent due dates circling like vultures and grocery runs limited to the discount aisle staples of rice and canned beans that tasted more like cardboard than comfort, forcing me to get creative with income streams that veered into morally gray territory, like signing up for that underground survey app that paid a few bucks for sharing personal data I later regretted handing over. The irony not lost on me that I was trading bits of my privacy for the fuel to build a tool meant to empower others against such exploitative systems. Yet the cash trickled in just enough to buy a second-hand external hard drive and some cheap coding software that promised more features than it delivered, crashes happening at the worst moments when I'd pour hours into algorithms designed to match users' work schedules with bite-sized learning modules drawn from free online archives. Humor found its way into the grind during those exhaustive evenings when I'd take breaks to rifle through a forgotten box of family mementos unearthed during a closet cleanout. Stumbling upon glossy prints from Lisa's high school graduation where my parents beamed like they'd invented perfection itself, and I'd let out a dry laugh at the exaggerated poses that screamed of staged bliss. Imagining them now scrolling through their feeds oblivious to how their discarded daughter was channeling their snubs into lines of code that could upend the very educational hierarchies they idolized. A private chuckle that cut through the isolation like a warm breeze on a frigid day. To stretch the budget further, I moonlighted as a virtual assistant for a fly-by-night online tutoring service that catered to wealthy kids cramming for exams. Typing out lesson summaries from dingy cafes where the Wi-Fi flickered like a bad connection to my past life, the client's demands for polished responses grating against my raw determination because it highlighted the privileges I'd been denied. But the payouts funded server hosting fees and even a basic website landing page that started drawing tentative signups from folks in similar straits, blue-collar workers from Pittsburgh factories or single moms in Detroit suburbs sharing testimonials about how the app's early features helped them brush up on resume skills without the shame of starting over at community college. That growing user base brought a flicker of validation amid the chaos. Yet it also amplified the pressure as glitches in the matching system led to frustrated emails that kept me up till dawn tweaking interfaces on a machine that overheated like a kettle on boil. My eyes burning from the strain while I munched on stale crackers to stay alert, the whole endeavor testing the limits of my resolve as doubts crept in about whether this bootstrapped dream could ever scale beyond a hobby without investors who saw value in an uncredentialed woman from the heartland. The mini-revenge opportunity arose unexpectedly one crisp autumn afternoon when a newsletter from my hometown Chamber of Commerce popped up in my inbox, touting my parents' latest philanthropic push through their church group aimed at scholarships for deserving high schoolers eyeing Ivy League paths, the hypocrisy of it all hitting me like a slap since. They'd never extended a dime my way after the Dropout fallout, and in a surge of sly satisfaction, I routed a modest sum from my first batch of app subscription fees, about $200 scraped from premium feature trials, through an anonymous online portal to a competing nonprofit focused on adult education grants for dropouts and career changers, earmarking it with a note that read, "For the overlooked talents in Ohio's forgotten corners," then sat back with a grin as social media buzzed. Days later about the surprise donations sparking debates at their gala event, my relatives no doubt toasting the generosity without a clue that the gesture came from the very outcast they'd labeled a lost cause. The witty sting of it warming me more than any direct confrontation ever could because it planted seeds of unease in their polished world without me lifting the veil. Emboldened yet exhausted, I mustered the courage to pitch the prototype at a regional tech incubator meetup in downtown Columbus, nerves jangling as I stood before a panel of venture types in their crisp shirts and skeptical smirks, laying out the vision of an app that democratized knowledge for the working class squeezed by rising costs and rigid systems. My voice steady despite the sweat beading under my collar, only to receive a form rejection email 2 weeks later citing insufficient traction and a resume that screamed amateur hour, the blow landing hard enough to send me spiraling into a night of pacing the apartment floor, questioning if their dismissal mirrored my family's all over again or if I needed to pivot harder into uncharted alliances. Just as despair threatened to swallow the progress whole, my inbox lit up with an unsolicited message from an unfamiliar domain tied to an academic institution. The sender inquiring about potential synergies between my platform and ongoing research in community learning initiatives, the signature name stirring a vague recognition from Lisa's old college. Brochures that I'd glimpsed years ago, leaving me frozen in the glow of my screen with a cocktail of intrigue and apprehension churning inside. Wondering if this olive branch from the ivory tower world my family revered was a genuine opportunity or a tangled thread pulling me inexorably back toward the ghosts I'd fought so hard to outrun. That intriguing email from the professor at Lisa's university evolved into a series of collaborative exchanges that felt like stumbling upon an oasis in the desert of my solo struggles. His expertise in adult education research providing the intellectual scaffolding I needed to refine the app's algorithms for better personalization. drawing on datasets from campus studies that highlighted barriers for non-traditional learners, much like the ones I'd bulldozed through in my own haphazard journey. Yet I kept my responses measured and professional, omitting any personal backstory that might link me to the Harper family name still whispered in academic circles back home. Because vulnerability in those early video calls where his face filled my screen amid the clutter of my apartment felt too risky when success hung by such a slender thread. With his encouragement propelling me forward, I launched a crowdfunding campaign on a platform geared towards social impact startups, crafting a pitch. Video shot on my phone in the local park where autumn leaves swirled like confetti around my earnest explanations of how the app could equip factory workers in places like Youngstown or nurses pulling double shifts in Cincinnati with credentials that opened doors without derailing their lives. The response pouring in from everyday folks who shared their own tales of educational dead ends in the comments section, raising enough, around $5,000 after fees, to hire a freelance developer whose portfolio promised reliability, but delivered a partnership laced with underlying tensions from the start. The beta version rolled out amid a flurry of testing phases that had me coordinating remotely with users across the Midwest. Their feedback loops revealing strengths in the community-driven content sharing where people uploaded tips on everything from basic accounting for small business owners to coding bootcamps adapted for shift workers, but also exposing vulnerabilities when server loads spiked during peak evening hours, forcing all-nighters where I'd pace my living room nursing a pot of tea that grew colder by the hour while patching code on the fly. The developer's input proving invaluable until subtle signs of envy emerged in his delayed responses and nitpicky critiques that bordered on sabotage, like when he accidentally overwrote a key feature during a shared session, claiming it was a glitch, but leaving me to reconstruct hours of work that tested my patience too. The breaking point. Humor surfaced in those tense collaborations when we'd joke over chat about the app's quirky avatar options resembling cartoon versions of pompous professors or overzealous life coaches. A lighthearted deflection from the growing friction that made me question if his jealousy stemmed from my unpolished background outshining his credentials or just the cutthroat freelance world where credit meant survival, yet I pressed on, integrating the professor's research to create modules on resilience training that drew from real-world case studies of career pivots, unknowingly weaving in elements that aligned with Lisa's business program curriculum since her university had piloted similar outreach tools in elective courses for extracurricular credits. The twist unfolded gradually through user analytics dashboards that lit up with activity from IP addresses clustered around her campus, beta testers logging in to access resume-building workshops and networking simulations that I designed with the raw frustration of my dropout days in mind. Features now inadvertently supporting the very students my family championed while they remained blissfully ignorant of the creator's identity, a poetic irony that brought a wry smile to my face during quiet moments reviewing the data, imagining Lisa tapping away on her laptop in the library praising this revolutionary platform, without a hint that her exiled sister had architected its core from the shadows of rejection. As downloads climbed toward the 10,000 mark and early reviews trickled into tech blogs highlighting the app's grassroots appeal for midlife reinvention, a nod to the demographic of parents and professionals in their 30s and 40s navigating economic squeezes, much like the audiences I envisioned tuning into stories of quiet triumphs, the pressure to scale amplified, leading me to a crossroads when a Women in Tech mentorship program reached out after spotting my campaign, the organizers' warm email inviting me to a virtual coffee chat where she shared her own path from single mom to startup advisor, her insights potentially unlocking grants and networks that could propel the app into full launch. But fear gripped me like an old habit. The specter of exposing my insecurities about appearance and family baggage, making me ghost the follow-up messages with vague excuses about scheduling conflicts, a choice born from the dread that opening up would invite pity echoing my mother's dismissive sighs rather than genuine partnership, even though deep down I knew it might have eased the isolation weighing heavier with each milestone. That stubborn isolation fueled a mini revenge of sorts when I funneled a portion of the crowdfunding surplus into sponsoring webinars for underrepresented creators at conferences my parents' social circle attended, anonymously crediting it to Harper Innovations in program notes that blurred the lines just enough to spark curious murmurs at their networking events, the subtle jab satisfying in its clever ambiguity as I pictured their puzzled exchanges over Chardonnay without connecting though. Dots to me, a witty undercurrent to the app's expanding footprint that kept the conflict simmering beneath the surface. Just as momentum built toward pitching to angel investors in Chicago, an ornate invitation arrived in my mailbox forwarded from an old address, the embossed card announcing Lisa's graduation ceremony in a few months, with all the flourish of a family milestone they couldn't resist broadcasting, the enclosed note from my mother, clipped and formal, stirring a turbulent mix of resentment and reluctant curiosity about the life she'd built on the ruins of my departure, prompting me to toy with the idea of attending incognito, slipping into the crowd like a ghost to witness their pride firsthand and gauge if the years had mellowed their judgments or merely entrenched them further, the decision hanging in the balance as I stared at the event details on my screen late one evening, heart thudding with the uncertainty of whether showing up would deliver the closure I craved or ignite a confrontation that unraveled everything I'd painstakingly reconstructed. Deciding to attend Lisa's graduation ceremony under the veil of anonymity marked a pivotal shift in my carefully guarded solitude. The kind of impulsive choice that had me second-guessing every step from the moment I boarded the early morning train from Columbus to the university town where the event unfolded, my nondescript trench coat and oversized sunglasses serving as a makeshift disguise amid the throng of families lugging bouquets and programs, the air buzzing with that anticipatory chatter of proud parents swapping stories about their prodigies while I weaved through them like a shadow. Heart pounding with a volatile blend of curiosity and the lingering sting of old wounds that urged me to turn back before anyone could spot the transformation 5 years had wrought in my posture and poise. Settling into a seat toward the back of the grand auditorium, its vaulted ceilings echoing with pre-ceremony announcements and the shuffle of feet on carpeted aisles, I scanned the crowd for familiar faces, spotting my parents almost immediately in a prime row near the stage where my father adjusted his tie with that self-important flourish he reserved for public displays, his booming laugh cutting through the din as he regaled a neighboring couple with tales of Lisa's academic triumphs, conveniently glossing over the financial maneuvering that had funneled every spare cent into her path while mine lay barren. And my mother fluttered about in her pastel suit, air-kissing relatives with calculated affection that masked the undercurrent of social climbing so evident in her whispered asides about the dean being a potential contact for future networking opportunities. Lisa emerged from backstage during the procession, her cap tassel swaying as she joined the graduates in their alphabetical march, looking every inch the poised professional in her flowing gown, but up close through my borrowed binoculars. Snuck in a purse that blended with the maternal accessories around me, I caught the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her smile faltered when my aunt enveloped her in a hug that lingered too long, hinting at the performative pressure cooker she'd navigated to reach this milestone. A dynamic that stirred an unwelcome twinge of empathy amid my resentment, because it echoed the invisible burdens we'd both shouldered in that household of conditional love. As the ceremony commenced with the national anthem swelling from the organ pipes and speeches droning on about the virtues of perseverance in an unforgiving economy, a theme that hit close to home for the midlife crowd in attendance, nodding along with knowing glances, the atmosphere thickened with shared nostalgia for the American dream of upward mobility. Yet my focus sharpened when faculty members took the podium to acknowledge contributors, the professor I'd collaborated with remotely stepping forward to laud an innovative app that had bolstered their outreach programs for adult learners, describing its seamless integration of real-time skill assessments and community forums that had empowered dozens of non-degree seekers to earn certifications right from their phones, words that unknowingly spotlighted my creation under the guise of anonymous philanthropy. The praise rippling through the audience like a subtle undercurrent while my family clapped politely, oblivious to the architect sitting mere rows away. The mini-revenge crystallized during the intermission mingle when I hovered near the refreshment tables laden with punch bowls and cookie platters, close enough to overhear my uncle holding court with a cluster of academics about how such tools were the future of equitable education, his voice laced with that faux expert tone he adopted after a few drinks at family reunions. And unable to resist the opportunity, I sidled up as an innocuous guest, inquiring about the program, injecting a casual remark about how true innovation often sprang from underdogs who'd been kicked to the curb by systems favoring the privileged, my delivery laced with just enough wry humor to plant a seed of discomfort in his furrowed brow without betraying my identity. The satisfaction blooming like a secret bloom as he stammered a non-committal agreement and wandered off, leaving me to sip my watery punch with a grin that masked the deeper ache of witnessing their world spin on without me. Tension escalated as the program resumed with award presentations, the dean's voice booming through the speakers to highlight partnerships that had transformed the curriculum, inadvertently name-dropping features from my app in ways that drew murmurs of approval from the crowd, including a cluster of Lisa's classmates who buzzed about how it had streamlined their group projects on workforce development. A twist that made my pulse quicken because it underscored the invisible threads connecting my exile to her elevation, yet the real conflict peaked when the professor's gaze swept the auditorium during a pause, locking onto me with a spark of recognition honed from our email threads and voice chats, his purposeful stride carrying him down the aisle through rustling programs and shifting seats until he stood before me, extending a hand in a warm clasp that conveyed the respect of a colleague finally meeting face to face. "You know her, don't you?" he murmured with a conspiratorial tilt of his head toward the stage where Lisa accepted her diploma amid flashing cameras. The question hanging laden with implication as nearby whispers began to circulate from a few rows over where my relative sat, fragments of conversation catching on the air about an unexpected guest whose name had surfaced in the contributor acknowledgments, leaving me locked in that handshake's firm grip with my mind racing through the razor-thin line between revelation and retreat, the growing murmur in the crowd hinting at an impending echo that could shatter the fragile anonymity I'd clung to like a lifeline. The professor's handshake lingered with an intensity that bridged the gap between our digital collaborations and this tangible moment in the auditorium's charged atmosphere, his eyes narrowing slightly in that knowing way academics have when piecing together the puzzle of a collaborator's hidden depths, while the crowd's murmurs swelled like a gathering storm around us. Fragments of conversation snagging on the edges of my awareness as the dean cleared his throat at the podium, signaling the shift toward the keynote address that would cap the ceremony with words meant to inspire the graduates stepping into a world fraught with economic uncertainties and personal reinventions, much like the ones I'd navigated in silence these past 5 years. Pulling back gently from the clasp, I managed a nod that conveyed composure amid the whirlwind inside, my mind flashing through the risks of this exposure as Lisa descended from the stage clutching her diploma, her gaze sweeping the audience with a mix of elation and fatigue that mirrored the post-ceremony glow on so many faces in the room. Yet when her eyes landed on me, framed by the professor's proximity, a flicker of confusion crossed her features, quickly masked by the obligatory hugs from our extended family, who swarmed like bees to honey, their congratulations laced with boasts about the Harper legacy now secured in her degree from this prestigious institution they'd sacrificed so much to fund. The dean's voice boomed anew, introducing the keynote speaker with a flourish that painted a vivid portrait of innovation born from adversity, recounting how this individual's app had revolutionized access to education for underserved communities across the heartland, from Rust Belt towns like ours to sprawling suburbs where midlife workers juggled jobs and dreams deferred. Details that wove in the very anecdotes I'd shared anonymously in our research exchanges, subtle clues like the emphasis on overcoming familial rejection to fuel technological breakthroughs now resonating through the speakers and drawing nods of recognition from the audience. many of whom related to the narrative of quiet persistence against judgmental kin and systemic barriers that defined so much of American resilience. My parents leaned forward in their seats, my father whispering something to my mother about the speaker's relatable grit that could motivate Lisa's career launch. Oblivious to the irony unfolding as the dean delved deeper into the backstory of a college dropout who'd bootstrapped her way to impact without the safety nets of privilege, words that struck too close to the bone for comfort. My mother's hand fluttering to her throat in a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times at tense dinners, her expression shifting from polite interest to dawning unease, as if the universe itself conspired to dredge up the ghosts they'd buried years ago. Humor edged into the tension when the dean quipped about how true pioneers often emerge from the unlikeliest corners, away from the spotlight of elite pedigrees, a line that elicited chuckles from the crowd but landed like a velvet-gloved punch for my relatives, my uncle letting out a nervous bark of laughter that betrayed his discomfort, while Lisa's head tilted quizzically toward the stage wings where the professor had subtly guided me during the intermission, the absurdity of the moment hitting me as I realized my simple black dress and pulled-back hair, chosen for blending in, now framed me as the focal point, a far cry from the rumpled dropout they'd dismissed with such finality. As the dean concluded with the full name, Emily Harper, echoing through the hall like a thunderclap that silenced the applause into stunned hush, the room erupted in a wave of curiosity mixed with the polite thunder of hands clapping, but from my family's row. The reaction cascaded into visible shock, heads whipping around in unison to locate the source, my father's jaw slackening in disbelief while my mother clutched her program as if it held the script to rewrite this impossible turn, their faces cycling through denial to a horrified comprehension that the architect of this celebrated tool was none other than the daughter they'd labeled an ugly embarrassment and cast aside without a backward glance. Ascending the stage steps with legs that felt steadied by the sheer momentum of revelation, I took the podium under the hot lights that bathed the graduates in a sea of upturned faces, launching into the speech with a voice honed from countless pitch practices in empty apartments, weaving tales of rejection's transformative fire into calls for empathy and education, infusing witty asides about how doubters' barbs often propel the boldest leaps, like turning family scorn into code that connects thousands, each phrase a clever thread of revenge that needled their complacency without direct accusation, the audience leaning in with empathetic laughter at lines poking fun at the pretensions of status-driven households that overlook hidden gems in their midst. The twist deepened during the address when I highlighted user stories from the app's beta phase, casually mentioning how it had supported business majors at this very university through anonymous mentorship modules that built networks for those under pressure to perform. A revelation that widened Lisa's eyes from her seat among the graduates as she pieced together the late-night sessions she'd credited to a mystery tool for her capstone project, exposing her unwitting reliance on my creation, while stirring questions about whether she'd ever questioned the source or silently endorsed the family narrative that sidelined me, a dilemma that made even me pause mid-sentence, wondering if her complicity in the silence had been active or just the byproduct of survival in our fractured dynamic. Post-speech, as the professor enveloped me in a congratulatory embrace on stage that broadcast our partnership to the hall, the applause swelled anew with the dean announcing a special recognition plaque for contributions to the program, my parents rising awkwardly amid the standing ovation, their approach hesitant through the milling crowd where relatives exchanged bewildered glances heavy with the hypocrisies I'd long suspected, like the under-the-table loans from Dad's firm that propped up Lisa's tuition at the expense of ethical corners cut elsewhere, the witty satisfaction of their discomfort blooming as I accepted the honor with a gracious smile that masked the inner conflict of whether this public vindication healed the scars or merely salved them superficially. In the aftermath, as well-wishers dispersed and Lisa navigated the chaos to reach me near the exit, her voice tentative with a question about how long I'd planned this surprise hanging unfinished in the air thick with unspoken histories, I offered only a measured embrace and a murmured acknowledgement of shared paths diverged by circumstance. Turning toward the auditorium doors with the echo of my name still reverberating in my ears, leaving the possibility of reconciliation dangling like an open thread. Did the triumph of recognition mend the rifts or merely illuminate their permanence? A question that lingered as I stepped into the cooling evening, pondering if walking away with questions intact was the truest form of closure, or just another layer of the uncertainty that had defined my journey all along.